December 1944, somewhere in the American Midwest. The snow outside the barbed wire glows pale under floodlights. Inside the camp canteen, a line of German prisoners stands silently, their breath rising in the cold air. Most are barely in their 20s, captured in North Africa, Sicily, or France. Their boots are worn, their faces hollow. They expect punishment, perhaps starvation. Instead, a young American guard slides a metal tray across the counter. On it, a slab of roast beef, mashed potatoes, peas, a slice of bread, even a steaming cup of coffee. The Germans exchange uncertain glances. One mutters, "For uns, for us." The guard only nods. A few sit, hesitant. Then, as the first bites are taken, the silence breaks into quiet disbelief. Some bow their heads. Others just stare at the food, unable to understand. For men raised on war's cruelty, this was impossible. By late 1943, the war had changed its shape. Across North Africa, the German Afrika Korps had fallen. Tens of thousands of prisoners, hardened veterans of Rommel's army, were now in Allied hands. The question was simple, yet vast. What to do with them all? The United States, shielded by an ocean, yet fueled by immense industrial power, offered an answer. With Europe in ruins and Britain overwhelmed, America agreed to house the growing tide of Axis prisoners. From 1942 onward, German POWs began arriving by the shipload. Silent, defeated men stepping off transport vessels in New York, New Orleans, and Norfolk. By the war's end, there would be over 425,000 German prisoners held across the U.S., scattered among more than 500 camps stretching from California's deserts to the pine forests of Wisconsin. Under the Geneva Convention of 1929, prisoners of war were to be treated humanely. Adequate food, shelter, medical care, and freedom from humiliation. Yet even those familiar with the treaty never imagined America would apply it so completely. Each camp was run with military precision, but also with restraint. POWs were issued standard U.S. Army rations, given work opportunities, even allowed to form orchestras, publish camp newspapers, and attend classes. Local civilians would often drive by the fences, staring in disbelief at the sight of captured Germans playing soccer or painting murals. For the prisoners, it was a world turned upside down. Many had been told that capture meant torture or death. Instead, they were fed 3 times a day: meat, fruit, and bread in portions that rivaled what many civilians in war-torn Europe could only dream of. But behind this seeming generosity was a deeper purpose, one rooted not in pity, but in principle. America's treatment of German POWs wasn't accidental. It was a statement, a demonstration of what it believed separated democracy from dictatorship. And for the men inside those fences, that contrast was about to become personal. Inside the wire, life settled into a strange rhythm, disciplined, yet humane. Each morning, prisoners stood for roll call beneath the fluttering stars and stripes, then marched to mess halls or work details. Many were assigned to nearby farms, lumber mills, or road crews. They earned small wages, in camp coupons rather than cash, which they could spend at canteens on soap, tobacco, or writing paper. Meals were structured according to U.S. Army standards. Breakfast might include scrambled eggs, oatmeal, coffee, and fruit. Lunch, thick sandwiches, soup, and occasionally cake. Dinner, stew, roast meat, potatoes, vegetables, and milk. For men who'd fought through the hunger of the Tunisian desert or the shortages of Europe, the abundance felt surreal. Some described it as unsettling, as if comfort itself were a trick. Letters home revealed their astonishment. One POW in Texas wrote, "We are fed better than our families in Germany." If our people knew this, they would not believe it. Even American guards found it remarkable. Soldiers who had fought friends of these same men now served them meals and ensured their welfare. Some locals resented it, believing that the prisoners lived better than civilians under wartime rationing. But the War Department held firm. The rules of the Geneva Convention would be honored, not just for morality's sake, but for strategy. How the U.S. treated its captives mattered. For Allied soldiers held in Germany, for propaganda across neutral nations, and for the moral image America wanted the world to see. Each meal served, every act of restraint, was a message. This is how a free nation wages war. And for the German soldiers who once believed in their own superiority, that message was both disarming and unforgettable. The contrast between belief and reality, between the Reich's indoctrination and America's quiet discipline, was the beginning of a slow transformation inside those camps. The first reaction among many German prisoners was disbelief. They had been taught that Americans were decadent, weak, and cruel, a people incapable of discipline or honor. Yet what they saw behind the wire contradicted every word of the propaganda they'd been fed. In camps from Camp Swift, Texas, to Fort Robinson, Nebraska, prisoners were treated not as monsters, but as men. American guards spoke firmly, but rarely with hatred. Medical staff tended to their wounds without distinction. The Red Cross visited regularly, ensuring rations and hygiene met international standards. Many POWs kept diaries, small notebooks filled with astonished observations. "We expected revenge," wrote one prisoner in Oklahoma, "but were met with decency." It shakes one's convictions. For younger soldiers raised under Nazi indoctrination, this treatment created an internal conflict. They had been told they fought for a higher civilization, yet the enemy fed them meat, bread, and milk, while their own families starved. Meals became moments of quiet reflection. At long wooden tables, men who had once chanted slogans of racial superiority now sat humbled, spooning mashed potatoes beside others who no longer spoke of the Führer with confidence. In time, these daily acts of normalcy, food, order, fairness, began to erode fanaticism. Chaplains visited. Educational programs offered English lessons and civics courses about democracy. At first, most refused to attend, but curiosity grew. Some prisoners admitted that what they experienced inside American camps began to reshape how they understood the war itself. "We came to destroy," one veteran later recalled, "and they taught us humanity instead." This was not sentimentality. It was realization. The same men who had bombed, invaded, and conquered were now being shown restraint, mercy, and respect by the very nation they had mocked. And in that quiet revelation, served daily on metal trays, the psychological war was already being won. At first glance, the generosity toward German POWs seemed irrational. America was at total war, its sons dying in Europe and the Pacific. Yet it spent valuable resources feeding enemy soldiers well. But behind that choice lay a blend of law, strategy, and moral vision. The United States adhered strictly to the Geneva Convention of 1929, not merely out of duty, but to set a precedent. By treating German captives humanely, the U.S. hoped its own prisoners in Europe might be shown the same. Every clean barracks, every inspected meal was both a shield and a message to the world. America fights hard, but not cruelly. Propaganda value also played a role. Newsreels occasionally hinted at POW camps, showing order, decency, and discipline, a deliberate contrast to reports of brutal conditions in Axis camps. Washington understood that perception mattered. Winning hearts and minds was not only about citizens at home, but about the future peace that would follow the war. Yet there was another, deeper layer, the moral dimension. For the U.S., feeding its enemies was not weakness, it was identity. It showed confidence, a belief that democracy could remain moral even in total war. To starve or humiliate captives would have made the U.S. no better than the regimes it fought to destroy. Some generals worried about morale. American civilians were living under rationing, and yet enemy prisoners received full rations. But President Roosevelt and the War Department refused to lower standards. "We will not lose our humanity," one internal memo read, "in the act of defending it." Even local communities saw benefits. German POWs often worked on farms or in factories, replacing men drafted to the front. Many Americans, at first wary, came to respect the discipline and manners of the prisoners. Some even shared meals through the wire. A quiet act of human decency repeated thousands of times across the heartland. By showing mercy, America had done something extraordinary. it had turned compassion into strategy. The true victory, however, would not come until the moment those same prisoners began to understand why. Spring 1945, the war in Europe is nearing its end. In thousands of American POW camps scattered across the South, Midwest, and Great Plains, a quiet transformation unfolds. The German soldiers who once saluted Hitler's portrait now stand at attention during morning roll calls with a different kind of silence, one not of defiance, but reflection. Letters from home tell them of cities in ruins, families starving, the Reich collapsing. Many no longer recognize the Germany they left behind. The master race they were told they belonged to now fights only to survive. And here, behind barbed wire in the land of their enemies, they eat better than their families back home. One German prisoner later wrote, "We could not believe the food, coffee, butter, real meat. It was not propaganda, it was kindness, and that shook us." Some prisoners began keeping small diaries, forbidden but widespread, where they recorded the daily absurdity of their situation. They described how American guards joked with them, how the Red Cross inspected their kitchens, how Christmas was celebrated with carols and even a small tree. A camp in Texas reported a unique problem. The prisoners were gaining too much weight compared to their rations in Europe. The War Department noted it in official records with disbelief. Inside these camps, something more powerful than military defeat was happening: ideological collapse. The propaganda that had driven millions to war began to dissolve under the quiet reality of American treatment. In the stillness of the night, around makeshift tables, many talked, not of revenge, but of the world that could follow. Teachers among them began giving lessons. A few learned English. Some started to question what they had believed about democracy, freedom, and even mercy. For the first time, the enemy wasn't the caricature painted by Goebbels. It was the man who guarded the gate, offered cigarettes, and treated them like human beings. The laughter that once filled Nazi barracks at tales of soft Americans had long faded. Now, the laughter had turned to quiet respect, and a kind of awakening none of them had expected. By mid-1945, the camps had become unlikely laboratories of change. Behind the fences, German officers debated not tactics, but truth. What had gone so wrong in their homeland? How could the nation that had conquered Europe be the same one reduced to rubble and starvation, while their enemy lived in abundance and order? American guards noticed it too. Some German POWs asked to read newspapers. Others requested English dictionaries. And when the Allied broadcasts announced Hitler's death on April 30, 1945, there was no cheer, no resistance, only stunned quiet. In one camp in Oklahoma, the WWII commandant walked through the mess hall just hours after the announcement. He expected anger or despair. Instead, he found men eating in silence, heads bowed. A few wept. The news, paired with the steady decency of their captors, shattered whatever remained of the myth they had been raised on. Some families received letters years later, written in careful English, thanking them for small kindnesses, for the meals shared through barbed wire, for the decency shown in wartime. In the ruins of Germany, that decency became a seed. When the Marshall Plan began in 1948, its architects understood something profound. Rebuilding a nation wasn't just about money. It was about faith in what people could become after hatred had failed. And many of those who once wore the uniform of the Reich carried that faith home from America's own Trudurti and Baranfu und Fi, Taninan. Heartland, by 1946, most German POWs had been sent home, but their memories of captivity in America lingered far longer than the war itself. For many, those camps became the first glimpse of a world beyond propaganda, a world where power didn't require cruelty. Historians later called it the quiet victory of values. While Europe smoldered, the U.S. had proven that democracy could fight and still remain decent. The food, the discipline, the fairness, all of it stood in stark contrast to the image Nazi Germany had painted of its enemies. In post-war letters and memoirs, countless former prisoners described how that experience reshaped them. One wrote, "I arrived as a Nazi, but left as a man." Another recalled how the sight of an American sergeant bowing his head for grace before a meal struck him harder than any battlefield defeat. Not all stories were idyllic. There were strict rules, punishments, even tensions, but the overwhelming testimony pointed to something undeniable. Within those fences, a different kind of war had been won, a moral one. When Germany rose again as a democracy in the 1950s, many of its new leaders and educators had once been POWs, men who had spent their formative years under the watch of Americans who treated them with respect. They carried those lessons quietly into the future, teaching their children that strength without compassion leads only to ruin. In the end, the story of German POWs in America wasn't one of defeat, but transformation. For both sides, it revealed a truth deeper than ideology, that even in war, humanity can prevail, not through conquest, but through the simple act of refusing to hate. They came as enemies, trained to believe that mercy was weakness, that victory justified all things. Yet, behind the fences of a foreign land, they found something far more powerful than any weapon: dignity. For the German prisoners, the taste of American food, roast beef, coffee, bread, became more than sustenance. It was a revelation. Each meal, each fair command, each small act of kindness chipped away at the machinery of hate that had driven a continent into chaos. And for the Americans who guarded them, it was a reminder, too, that the true test of a nation isn't how it fights its wars, but how it treats those it has already defeated. History rarely remembers these quiet battles. No medals were awarded, no headlines written. Yet, within those guarded camps, a deeper victory was won, one that no bomb could claim. It was the triumph of principle over vengeance, of humanity over ideology. Because in the end, what truly defeated Nazism wasn't just the might of Allied armies, but the moral courage to remain kind, even to the enemy.